This is my final judgment and the last word. I'm writing to you about an event that happened 37 years ago, the disciplining and ultimate sacking of my husband, Desmond Ford, at Glacier View in Colorado, USA. I now understand more fully how Neil Wilson, Elder Neil Wilson, and Pastor Keith Parmenter orchestrated this event. I'm not speaking here so much of differences in doctrinal opinion. This has been recorded elsewhere. Rather, I'm describing some of the methods used. And I don't believe that even the attendees fully understood this at the time or now. Glacier View was a very complex event with over 100 attendees from the World Church, and there would be many personal views of what happened there. The attendees included administrators, scholars, pastors, educators, authors, who held a variety of Adventist beliefs. I've recently completed about 9 or 10 hours of video on this specific subject, how Des was fired. And my husband has done another 4 or 5 hours of video at my request. And to make things simpler, I offer here my conclusions. And in this process, I've done summaries before and thought I was finished. But I wasn't able to write this document until I had done the last video. And I found a key point that I hadn't fully realised before. I have a lot of documentary evidence to show that what I'm telling you is as accurate as I now know. And because I've never been party to what the General Conference administrators thought or said, I can only state what I think happened and the evidence I have for it. The production of the Statement of 27 Fundamental Beliefs from 1978, culminating in its near finalisation at the Dallas General Conference in April 1980, is key to understanding what happened at Glacier View. In my memory, I don't know as there's a record of this, there might be, in Elder Neil Wilson's inaugural speech at Glacier View, he made it clear how the group would proceed. He stated that they'd produced the Statement of 27 Fundamental Beliefs at Dallas, and the group at Glacier View was not going to advance beyond it. The vote at the end of the week was going to be all one way. It wasn't going to be half and half. And I thought to myself at the time, and Des and I said to each other, he's telling us how it's going to end up, and it's not going to be favourable to Des. Small committees spent part of each morning, Monday to Thursday, discussing key topics connected with the sanctuary doctrine. And each afternoon, the leaders of the group gave reports to the whole group in plenary sessions about their group's conclusions. By Friday morning, these reports had been blended into 2 consensus statements, one on the Church's biblical position and another on Ellen White's theology. Now, these consensus statements made considerable advances from the Church's traditional views, and Des would later state that they supported his 900-page document, which was called Daniel 8:14, the Day of Atonement and the Investigative Judgment, in 7 to 10 key areas, and 7 of these were crucial. The Ministry magazine of September 1980 denied that this was true, stating that this was all in Des's mind. However, note the following letter from Emeritus Professor Lawrence Geraghty to Elder Kenneth Wood about the biased reporting of the Adventist Review on Glacier View. To announce on the back page, August 28, variant views rejected, was at least a half-truth. The other half is that many of the views advocated by Dr. Ford were accepted by the consensus statements. Why was that not brought out? Are we afraid to publicly admit the progress we made in Colorado at arriving at a clearer, more biblically based doctrine of the sanctuary? He continues, in at least 7 of the 10 points, the consensus statement moves significantly in Dr. Ford's direction. This is nowhere explicitly shared with your readers. This letter was dated September the 15th, 1980, from Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and I have included it in a number of documents that I am going to put with the videos. The fact is that the consensus statements were not used in judging Des's manuscript at all. The care and attention taken by the small group committees and the committee at large, thinking that their work was making a contribution and that it was part of a just process, was virtually a waste of time and energy. Though these statements were published in the Ministry magazine of September 1980, they were buried afterwards. Another and different type of document was used instead to discipline Des on the Friday afternoon. On the previous Tuesday, Elder Neil Wilson had approached 6 men out of the whole group: Robert S. Spangler, Herbert Douglas, Rao Dedrin, James Londis, Arthur Furch, and Norman Young. These were asked to write a 10-point list of where Des differed from the traditional view of the sanctuary. Note that at least 4 men out of the 6 would have had problems agreeing to this list themselves. Also note the statement had no evidence in it. It was just a list of differences. The plenary group had read the 2 consensus statements with copies in their hands and voted on it that Friday morning. Then we were asked to leave, and the 10-point statement written by the 6, which was not duplicated, was just read out from the front, and it was not voted on. From a scholarly viewpoint, even the Dallas Statement on the Sanctuary, currently number 24 out of 28 fundamentals, showed advances from the traditional view of the pioneers. But from Elder Neil Wilson's viewpoint, the traditional view and the Dallas Statement of Fundamental Beliefs are essentially the same thing. Now at Dallas, Neil Wilson stated from the front, and listen to it carefully, "We are not suggesting changing any belief or doctrine that this church has held. We have no interest in tearing up any of the foundations of historical Adventism. This document is not designed to do that or to open the way so that it can be done. It should be clear we are not adding anything, nor are we deleting anything in terms of historical Adventist theology. We are trying to express our beliefs in a way that will be understood today." And that statement is recorded by Dr. Lawrence Geraghty in a new statement of Fundamental Beliefs, 1980, on the Spectrum magazine website, dated the 7th of June in 2009. For Elder Neil Wilson, the traditional view and the Dallas Statement were the same, and any differences were just a matter of semantics. I really didn't understand this until the last video that I did. So when Elder Wilson said at the beginning of Glacier View that the Dallas Statement was the benchmark and that this group was not going to advance, he told his truth exactly, and he carried out what he said he was going to do. On the Friday afternoon, the brethren allowed Des to read the 10-point statement. He questioned the first point about his misquoting sources. He changed the wording of the point about the year-day principle. He then told the brethren it was a fair description of the differences between his view and the traditional view of the sanctuary from the pioneer position. However, he stated it contains no evidence. Elder Spangler assured him there would be evidence by the time it was printed in the ministry magazine. Des said he hoped that he would receive a copy before it was published. In fact, he was taken off the mailing list before that and received a copy after everyone else read it. When Des stated to the brethren on Friday afternoon that the consensus statements went towards his manuscript in 7 crucial areas, they did not believe him. Elder F. Wernick stated, "If I believed the consensus statements went towards your view, I would not have voted for them." And that, dear reader, is how they dealt with Des doctrinally. They used the Dallas Statement, that is, the traditional view of the sanctuary, to judge Des. All of those who attended Glacier View, who contributed to the consensus statements, who thought that their opinion mattered, who believed they were helping the church advance, were misled. The consensus statements were, in fact, an exercise in futility, a sop to the scholars, that they had any say in what was happening. On a second contributory subject to the disciplining of Des, and I've mentioned it elsewhere, I mentioned the accusation about Des's poor judgment. Much time was given to his supposed collusion with Bob Brinsmead. The attendees were oblivious to this. The discussion was kept for the Friday afternoon disciplinary meeting only. The only allusion you will find in the September Ministry magazine to Bob Brinsmead is this sentence from Bob Spangler, pages 5 and the beginning of page 6. Just why Dr. Ford chose the October 27 forum to bring his private views on this issue to the attention of the Adventist public is not clear, although he has stated on several occasions that a reason for his public presentation of his beliefs was to counteract the work of Verdict Publications, a dissident organisation that not only has energetically promoted Ford's tapes of the 27th of October 1979 forum at PUC and materials, but has views strikingly similar to those to Des on the sanctuary doctrine. The phrase I'm focusing on is that not only has energetically promoted Ford's tapes, I found out later, as I've mentioned elsewhere, that this accusation was completely unfounded. And as an aside, to answer why Dr. Ford chose the October 27 forum to bring his private views to the attention of the Adventist public, was because the leaders of the Adventist forum at PUC asked him to do it because of the publication of Bob Brinsmead's book. And he said to them, it will cause trouble. And they said, well, you'll be protected under the auspices of forum. But clearly he wasn't. When Elder Spangler discussed on pages 8 and 9 in the September 1980 Ministry magazine what happened during the Friday afternoon meeting where Des and I met with Prexad and Pastor Keith Parmenter and Arthur Duffy of the Australasian Division, any mention of Bob Brinsmead is absent, and yet when you read the actual transcripts of the notes used to write this section, and I have read these out on my videos 6 and 7, Bob Brinsmead was a key part of the discussion on the Friday afternoon. The brethren had been told and believed that that Des and I were colluding with Bob. There were rumours that flew around the Australasian division before and during Glacier View. Our friends told us about them later. We heard fragments, but we'd lived in USA for 3 years. We weren't aware of what was being said. I was supposed to be the mediator between Des and Bob. I wasn't. I was seen phoning out in the evenings, and the brethren thought I was calling Bob. I didn't. It took me 8 years to find out what was behind these rumours. According to Robert Brinsmead, his brother John was upset with Bob when he changed his mind on the investigative judgment and was researching and writing 1844 Re-examined, which came out in the summer of 1979. As a result, John went down and consulted with Keith Parmenter, the division president in Australia, about a year before Glacier View. There's documentary evidence of this from both sides, from Bob Brinsmead and from one of the division officers. Bob told me that these visits were ongoing, with John being a type of consultant to the Australasian division on what was happening between Bob and Des. John Brinsmead claimed that Des was in cahoots with Bob and they were on a mission to destroy the church, and that Des could say he was not involved because I was the mediator. None of this was true. It was just not true. In the Friday afternoon meeting, Neil Wilson accused Des of colluding with Bob to send out 50,000 tapes of his October 27, 1907 forum tape. In 2007, 27 years after Glacier View, and while people were still out alive, I decided to find out who sent out those tapes. And I discovered that Verdict Publication, viz. Bob, did not send out any of those tapes at all. They didn't send out any of Des's materials either. Now, Dr. Dean Jennings recorded those meetings at PUC, and so did Eric Syme. Dr. Jennings only sent out 7 copies of the cassette. An acquaintance in New Mexico got hold of the tape and duplicated it and sent it out. Possibly about 1,000 copies, according to his wife, but she was over 80 when I spoke to her and couldn't really remember. But her son, a psychiatrist in California, wrote to her and said, "Mum, you did send out those tapes." The copies kept in the libraries of Avondale College and Pacific Union College both came from the New Mexico address. And when the tape got to Australia, other people duplicated and sent out multiple copies. Rob Thompson was one of them, and he knew others. Des and I had no part in organising the sending out of any of those tapes, but his general policy was and is that people can copy whatever they like of his works. The fact of colluding with Bob over anything, never mind sending out the tapes, was not true at all. The figure of 50,000 tapes was fabricated, I presume by John Brinsmead, who would have told Elder Parmenter, who would have passed it on to Neil Wilson. They did not divulge this, but they acted as though it was true. Moreover, when we denied it, they did not believe us. The administration said that Des was exceptionally brilliant, but had poor judgment and used sources wrongly. And those 3 attributes, when you think about it, don't really go together. Other, better judges of scholarly documents disagreed. The administration said that Des was a person of great integrity, and yet they accused him of colluding with Bob to destroy the church. They did not disclose, before, during, or afterwards, what was behind the accusations about Brinsmead. They believed John Brinsmead, and they did not believe us. They said that Des and I colluded with Bob Brinsmead, but in fact, Elder Parmenter colluded with John Brinsmead, and Elder Neil Wilson accepted what Pastor Parmenter told him as fact. And Des and I were judged in a grossly unfair way because it fitted in with the Brethren's desires and designs to get rid of Des as quickly as possible. The ministry magazine focused on how the Brethren pled with Des for him to stay with the church. Their comments in the ministry and Parmenter's letter to Des, published therein, are glossed with self-righteous religiosity. They used a velvet glove that covered an iron fist, the rankest of hypocrisy. In fact, their intention was the opposite of keeping him in the church, and their actions were deliberate. Parmenter gave Des an original letter. He read it out to him verbally. We never had the original letter. It was very harsh during the Friday afternoon meeting. One of the terms he gave Des was to damn Bob Brinsmead in the review. Another was that he must not just shelve his views, but change his mind and say so publicly. They gave him 2 weeks. But Des said he could never accede to these demands. He would not damn Brinsmead, who at the time was publishing Righteousness by Faith. Neither could he change his mind. It would have been a lie. Parmenter's published letter was greatly toned down from the original. In the letter published in the ministry, the demand about Brinsmead is absent, and the demand to change his mind is restated as hold in suspense your particular views, and that these will be held in abeyance and not discussed. This holding in suspense was not an option that was given during the Friday afternoon. In summary, Neil Wilson believed that traditional Adventism and the 27 fundamentals were the same, just that the Dallas Statement had used modern language. He said at the beginning of Glacier View that the Dallas Statement was going to be the benchmark of the judgment against Des. He stated in the ministry magazine that this was what was used to judge Des, and that the consensus statements were not part of our fundamental beliefs. Note this statement in the introduction of the September 1980 Ministry magazine, which says what I've just said in their words. Let it be clearly understood that what we have printed in the question and answer session is not to be taken as the official view of the Church on the sanctuary doctrine. We have only one official view, the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs, voted at our April 1980 General Conference session. Even Christ in the Heavenly Sanctuary, that is, the consensus statement, adopted at the Glacier View meeting, is not the official view of the Church, other than that portion taken from our fundamental beliefs. Parmenter's published letters also use the Dallas Statement as the bench part. So that explains something I had not realised before I began restudying this a month ago. Elder Neil Wilson thought that the Dallas Statement and traditional Adventism were the same. The difference was only semantics, and it was always their intention to fire Des doctrinally over this. As I've said, the consensus statement was a sop to the scholars. Its advances were not considered at all. In fact, they denied that any advance had been made. Can you imagine the spending of millions of dollars that the Glacier View Week involved? Can you imagine all the travel costs and all those people travelling across the world to take part in Glacier View? Can you imagine all the work involved in putting together the consensus statements, all the meetings, all the reports from the leaders of the groups, all the work overnight, spending the whole night putting the consensus statements together? They were never used. The miracle is that the church administration actually published in the ministry magazine for all to read. So you can look at the Dallas Statement, you can look at the consensus statements and see the differences. After the ministry magazine, They ignored the findings of the consensus statements and published instead the DARCOM series of 7 large tomes, which purportedly answered Des Ford. According to Roy Ingram, only 2 or 3% of the contents of the DARCOM series addressed the real issues that Des raised. And according to Dr. Norman Young, it was a snow job. A blizzard of facts, this is my words, a blizzard of facts to cover up. Now, this pre-planned action could never have concluded in a just verdict for Des. The use of the traditional view, the Dallas Statement, according to Elder Wilson, with the false and unfair accusations about Des's collusion with Bob Brinsmead, are the main keys to understanding the way Des was dealt with. Even the participants at Glacier View, apart from the few, did not and do not understand this. The saddest thing about this is the way the church treated the main proponent of the gospel of righteousness by faith. It was more important to support the traditions of the church than it was to improve the anti-gospel sentiments of our sanctuary doctrine and that horrible doctrine of the investigative judgment, which has robbed many older church members of their peace. Now, my friends, I wish I was a better speaker, like my husband. I've had very little experience of speaking, and this is the first time I've ever done any videos. And as I went along, I misread words and I made some mistakes. I also said somewhere that in the meetings of the 1983 meeting, in the Sabbath meeting of a set of meetings that we had in San Francisco between the GC and Des and the men at Good News, I said there are a number of witnesses to the statement that the brethren apologised for the way Glacier View was run. They said that Elder Wilson, Elder Parmenter, had come over from Australia with a demand that Des be dealt with that week. Now compare that with the pious note of his 4-point letter. And I said that there were witnesses there, and I mentioned the men at Good News, and I said the Australasian Division, and the fact was, it was the General Conference members who were there, not the Australasian Division. So I've made some flubs, I've made some mistakes, and we've tried to correct most of them, but a few of them will go through. And anyway, as I've said all along, I don't expect many people to watch these videos right through. I've done this mainly for the historians who are going to write up Glacier View eventually in a way that I hope is fairer because I've done this. Thank you for listening to me, and God bless.